Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a gladiator or an emperor, but with something far more dangerous and complicated, dating in ancient Rome, because, believe it or not, finding love in a time of arranged marriages, political alliances, and public baths was somehow even more awkward than texting someone you up at 2 a.m. from marriage negotiations that resembled Senate debates to courtship rituals involving more witnesses than a criminal trial. Roman romance was less about butterflies and more about strategic family mergers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you're standing in the Roman Forum, or maybe lounging in a villa, wondering how to find love. Maybe strike up a conversation, compliment someone's toga, ask if they come here often. Nope, that's not how any of this works. If you're in ancient Rome, dating in the modern sense doesn't really exist. You don't flirt, text, or go for long walks to see where it goes. Instead, your parents, or your lord, or your patron are already deciding who you'll marry, when, and how many denarii it will take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've probably been betrothed since before your voice dropped. You and your future spouse might meet for the first time on your wedding day. And yes, that's just as uncomfortable as it sounds. The whole thing is about land, titles, and family alliances, not compatibility or how good they are at chariot racing. If you're a plebeian, things are slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still has a strong say, and love isn't really part of the discussion. Maybe your parents know a nice girl whose family owns a productive bakery. Maybe they admire a boy who can build aqueducts without flooding the neighborhood. Boom, you're courting now. Lucky you. It's not that people in ancient Rome don't feel romantic. They do. It's just not the priority. The goal is survival, inheritance, and social stability. Falling in love before marriage, that's risky. Falling in love outside of marriage, that's scandalous. Either way, it's frowned upon unless you're a character in an elegiac poem, in which case, go wild. And yet you dream. Maybe you write a little verse on a scrap of papyrus. Maybe you sneak a glance across the market. Maybe, just maybe, you fall for someone who wasn't pre-approved by your family's financial advisor. But for now, you wait. You obey. You try not to fall for the blacksmith's apprentice, because in this world, love might be the goal of poets, but marriage is the work of parents, priests, and politics. So you think someone's cute. Maybe it's the way they balance a basket of grapes on their head. Maybe it's the confident way they debate philosophy in the garden. Your Roman heart skips a beat. But steady yourself, because in this world, romance doesn't bloom without a balance sheet. Before you even think about courtship, you'd better ask, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is a charming personality, you might want to sit down. If you're a young man, you'll need land, or livestock, or tools, or a villa that doesn't collapse during earthquakes. Love letters are nice, but nothing says husband material like 2 healthy oxen and a roof that can survive a mild tremor. If your father has already promised the best dowry to your brother, well, you might want to consider the legions. If you're a young woman, your family needs a dowry that could be coin, clothing, or a suspiciously generous number of household slaves. Doesn't matter how witty you are. If your family can't pay up, you're likely to spend a long time perfecting your weaving alone. Now, let's say you actually like someone who makes your Roman heart flutter. You lock eyes at the baths. There's a spark. It's romantic. It's poetic. It's completely irrelevant, because unless your families are on equal financial footing, you might as well fall in love with a statue. If you're noble, it gets worse. Your hand in marriage is tied to land, borders, and political favors. You're not just a person. You're a walking treaty. Congratulations. Even plebeians aren't safe. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion. You settle for irrigation rights, and yet you try. Maybe you offer a small gift, a carved spoon, a handful of olives, or your finest slightly cracked amphora. Maybe they smile, maybe they don't. But the truth remains. In Roman dating, economics is the flirting, and love is just a bonus you hope your spouse develops eventually. So let's say you're not a peasant worrying about pigs or a noble dealing with treaties. Let's say you're a wealthy Roman with questionable poetry skills. What's your love life like? Welcome to the strange and emotionally exhausting world of elegiac love poetry. Now this isn't dating. This is performance art. Elegiac love was a Roman pastime, part flirting, part spiritual suffering, and entirely impractical. You, the tormented poet, choose a woman, usually one who's already married, and vow to adore her from afar. Not physically, of course. That would ruin everything. No, you're supposed to suffer elegantly. You might compose a few tortured verses about her silver laugh, or how her hair burns like Apollo's light, which in Roman terms means she has hair and didn't insult your family. You wear her colors at the games, you pine, you sigh, you occasionally challenge someone to a duel just because he glanced at her too long. The lady's role. She's supposed to pretend this is all very flattering, while maintaining a level of icy detachment that would terrify a glacier. She may respond with a letter, a token, maybe a ribbon, but mostly she'll just be mysterious and unattainable, which is the entire point. The emotions are high, the actual contact minimal at best. You might get a nod from across the atrium, or a finger brushed against your toga during a feast. Anything more, and suddenly it's not elegiac love. It's a scandal, or worse, adultery. And no one wants that, at least not officially. This entire setup worked best when everyone involved agreed it was mostly pretend. It was a way to express longing, devotion, and creative angst, all without disrupting the social order. A Roman venting mechanism, if you will. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. Did it involve more poetry than practicality? Constantly, but for a poet stuck between military campaigns and boredom. Elegiac love gave you something to write about and someone to write for. Just don't expect a happy ending, or a kiss, or even eye contact. So you've fallen for someone great. Now comes the hard part, expressing that affection in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone is basically a declaration of war. Welcome to the Roman solution, tokens and letters. Think of it as first-century texting, slow, confusing, and open to wildly inaccurate interpretation. Let's say you're a young patrician, and you're hopelessly in love with Julia of whatever her family name is. You can't speak to her alone, and your poems keep getting intercepted by her tutor. What do? You send her a ring, or maybe your embroidered handkerchief. Nothing says I love you like mailing someone part of your wardrobe. And if you're on the receiving end, congratulations, you now have a sweaty linen cloth you didn't ask for, and the romantic burden of pretending you know what it means is he. Confessing love, asking for a favor, suggesting a business partnership. Who knows? Women gave tokens to a ribbon, a piece of jewelry, a tiny carved figure. It was sentimental, sure, but also deeply strategic. Give the wrong guy the wrong token, and suddenly you're spoken for by someone with a lazy eye and a gambling problem. Tokens were meant to be subtle. A ring pinned to your chest, a ribbon tied to your belt. Everyone knew what it meant, and no one said what it meant. The more cryptic, the better. It was less about communication and more about plausible deniability. Oh, this ring. No, it's not from Marcus. It just appeared on my pillow, scented with roses. Completely random. For commoners, tokens were simpler. Maybe a wood carving. Maybe a handkerchief you stitched when you weren't working the family shop. It was still romantic, just with more calluses involved. Tokens were also risky. Giving one to the wrong person could spark rumors. Receiving one you didn't want meant figuring out how to politely return someone's jewelry without insulting their lineage. But for all the awkwardness, these tokens carried real emotional weight. They were symbols of love in a world that didn't allow much room for it. So you finally build up the courage to talk to your crush. Maybe offer them a flower, maybe quote a little Ovid you definitely didn't steal from a traveling poet. You're ready for a moment of intimacy. Unfortunately, you're not alone. Welcome to the world of Roman dating surveillance, where love is never blind, it's heavily monitored by your mother, your pedagogue, a nosy cousin, and sometimes all three at once. Let's say you're a young woman of marrying age. You're never just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with your maid and her terrifyingly strict aunt, who's already judging your posture. Even if you're simply fetching water, someone is watching. Someone is always watching. It's less dating, more espionage. And if you're a man trying to court someone, better hope you have the approval of her family, her male relatives, and the local gossip network. You show up at her house with flowers. Her father's behind the door, sharpening something. Her mother's pretending to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours. And the family tutor just happens to be passing by on his way to morning lessons. At sunset, the logic behind all this supervision was simple. Protect virtue, preserve family honor, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage, especially alone, especially ever. Chaperones were there to monitor innocent interactions, group outings, supervised walks, sitting within a 2 radius of each other on a bench, only if someone's grandmother is weaving nearby and pretending not to listen. The state, of course, had opinions, lots of them. It regulated courtship the way a general regulates a legion. Officials gave speeches about proper conduct and wrote lengthy treatises on the dangers of flirtation. Yes, that's right, Roman bureaucrats published anti-flirting manuals. Imagine someone copying those out by lamplight. while scribes silently judge you from across the scriptorium. Even letter writing wasn't safe. Some families opened love letters just to screen for moral content. That's right, domestic censorship. So if you want to fall in love, you'll have to get used to doing it quietly and in the presence of your entire extended family, ... and possibly Jupiter. So you're in love, or at least Roman style in love, which is mostly longing, confusion, and a lot of pacing near fountains. You've exchanged glances across a feast. Maybe they picked up your dropped scroll and didn't immediately throw it into the fire. The tension is unbearable, but you still can't speak freely. There are chaperones, tutors, mothers lurking like emotional border patrol agents. So what do? You write a letter. Ah yes, the secret love letter, the most dangerous piece of papyrus since a tax assessment. This is your chance to confess your heart using the most cryptic, overly poetic language possible. Because you can't just say, I like you. You must say, my soul is a ship tossed by the storms of your beauty, seeking harbor in the gentle port of your affection. Naturally, if you're literate, which, let's be honest, isn't a given, you pen your message on quality papyrus or wax tablets. If you're really dedicated, you dust it with flower petals or perfume. Just be careful with that. One senator accidentally used a love letter to Rapfish and delivered it to the wrong villa. They're married now, it's fine. Now comes the problem of delivery. You can't just hand it over. You need a courier, a loyal slave, a bribed servant, or a younger sibling with limited understanding of consequences. Sometimes even a performer would do the job, singing your poem in the forum while pretending it was anonymous. Subtle, and the poetry risky, very risky. The line between romantic and seditious was thinner than gold leaf. During a financial crisis, if your metaphor even hinted at anything inappropriate, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary treason. But despite all the rules, people did write. Some letters survived. Some poems were copied and passed around like forbidden scrolls. In a world of rigid rules and constant supervision, a folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. So you write, you risk it. You press your stylus to the wax and say everything you can't say aloud. Just don't sign it too clearly. You want romance, not a Senate trial. Finally, a break. A feast day, a harvest festival, a chariot race. In short, a rare moment when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not interested in the merchant's daughter. Today, you're allowed to flirt, sort of, as long as no one sees. Or everyone sees but pretends not to. Welcome to Roman festivals, where romance blooms under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met, and 3 sacrificial chickens. Festivals were one of the few socially approved moments when men and women could mingle, laugh, and dare we say, make eye contact. There's music, there's wine, there's someone wearing a flower crown with dangerous confidence. You've never seen so many people not pretending to discuss business. If you're a plebeian, you might try to impress your crush by winning the foot race, catching a greased pig, or juggling 3 stale loaves of bread. Nothing says I'm available like falling off a platform with dignity. Dancing was your best shot at actual physical contact. The rules were rigid, but a well-timed spin or a not-quite accidental hand graze could say more than any poem. The spring festivals, for example, were basically a giant excuse for coordinated flirtation wrapped in religious ceremony and plausible deniability. And if you're noble, your version of flirting at a festival involved less physical activity and more intellectual display. You might compose a verse on the spot. Compare your lady's eyes to twin stars or other glowing things, and offer a trinket. Hopefully not one that was clearly made by your slave 5 minutes earlier. Food helped too. Offer your beloved a meat pie or share honeyed wine. If they accept it with a smile, you're doing well. If they hand it to their slave, start over with someone else. But remember, everything you do, someone is watching. A parent, a priest, a bard with a big mouth. One misstep and your flirty smile becomes a youthful indiscretion discussed at the baths for the next 6 weeks. Still, for a few hours you can pretend you're in a world where love isn't a transaction, where laughter isn't suspicious, and where dancing in public doesn't end in a lecture about virtue. Let's say you're not a patrician, a senator, or a poet with excessive feelings. You're a regular Roman citizen. You wake up before dawn, work until sunset, and spend most of your day trying to afford bread that doesn't taste like sawdust. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can manage a household without setting it on fire. Welcome to plebeian courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we can survive winter together. In your world, dating is less about long conversations and more about shared tasks. You notice someone you like because they work hard, don't complain much, and have a decent set of teeth. That's it. That's the whole checklist. You're not picky, you're realistic. You don't need fireworks. You need someone who can gut a fish and maybe doesn't snore too loudly. So how do you show interest? You give gifts, small, useful things. A basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a good turnip, and if you're feeling bold, maybe a woven ribbon or a carved spoon. Nothing says, I'm serious about you, like a spoon you whittled by lamplight while your family provided commentary. Conversations happen during shared chores. You might walk together to the mill, chat while tending animals, or exchange pleasantries while shoveling something that smells questionable. No one's reciting Virgil. You're talking about the weather, crop yields, and whether old Marcus fell in the well again. And yet, in its own way, it's romantic. There's a sweetness in the simplicity, a shared life built not on idealism, but on cooperation. You know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and how fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals often came quickly. If you both agreed, and the families did too, marriage followed. Maybe you moved into a shared apartment. Maybe you built a new one from scratch with help from the neighborhood. You brought your best cooking pot. They brought a goat. Together you began the strange miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You've done it. You found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. True love, right? Now it's time to get married, which in Roman terms means you're entering into a contract, not a dreamy vow under the stars, but a legally binding transaction, often negotiated with all the passion of a livestock auction. If you're a plebeian, it's still a big deal. You gather a few witnesses, talk to the local magistrate, and try not to trip over the Latin during the ceremony. But behind the sweet-sounding blessings is a serious checklist. Dowry, property rights, who gets what, and what happens if someone dies during military service. Ah yes, romance. If you're from the upper class, buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown legal negotiation. Your parents, their parents, the lawyers, the scribes, maybe a senator who once studied law, they're all in on it. The bride and groom are mostly just standing nearby, looking decorative and nodding when spoken to. You may or may not have even met the person you're marrying. Your family has done the math. Your estate needs her fields, her dowry balances, your debts, and both of your family names look good next to each other. Love is optional. The merger is not. And once you're married, it's permanent. Divorce isn't really a thing unless you can prove someone wasn't a citizen, was secretly related to you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments existed, but they required a lot of paperwork, a bit of luck, and a solid bribe. Still, not everything is bleak. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other, shared chores, raising children, surviving plagues. These things have a way of building affection, or at least tolerance, which in Roman terms is basically the same thing. The state was involved in every step. Marriage was a civic duty, one of your obligations to the Republic. You didn't just marry for legal reasons. You married because Rome needed citizens, taxpayers, and future soldiers. So you stand, exchange vows, and smile as someone hands over a sack of coins and calls it a blessing. So let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of grains. You're a noble, but for once you want to marry for love, not for land, not for lineage, not for your fathers. Strategic ambitions, just love. Congratulations, you're about to cause a scandal. Noble elopements were the Roman equivalent of lighting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. If you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing, it wasn't just personal rebellion, it was political sabotage. Let's say you're Livia, promised to boring but wealthy Gaius to secure trading rights, but you've fallen madly in love with a penniless gladiator who smells faintly of olive oil and danger. You meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings in the shadows, and one day you vanish to a small temple where the priest owes you a favor. There you marry under questionable legality, with only a nervous priest and 2 startled doves as witnesses. Back at home, chaos. Your family outraged, your father threatening to disinherit you and possibly have the groom arrested, your mother dramatically weeping into her silk stola, the neighbors absolutely delighted by the gossip. And if you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case scenario, you get to keep your bride and your citizenship. Worst case, you're exiled and financially ruined in that order. Still, some couples got away with it. If the union couldn't be undone without causing even more embarrassment, families sometimes just sighed and moved on. After all, what's done is done, and at least nobody died. Hopefully, in rare cases, these scandals became legends. Songs were written, poems composed, stories whispered at banquets, to nobles who chose love over duty, practically mythological. And yes, most Roman marriages were transactional, but these moments, brief rebellions, passionate escapes, whispered vows beneath moonlit colonnades, they reminded the world that love though inconvenient, refused to go extinct. So if you ever feel dramatic for swiping left or turning down a second date, just remember, at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, angry senators, and a horse tied to a rope ladder outside your window. Our marriage, that beautiful union of two souls and their respective financial portfolios. Because in ancient Rome, love was nice, but a dowry, now that was truly romantic. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married, you're being launched like a small, dowry-equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your dowry: money, livestock, land, household slaves, a villa or two, depending on how marriageable they think you are, and maybe even a set of silver dishes if they're feeling generous. These offerings go to your future husband, who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator. Now flip the scenario. In some regions, it's not the bride's family giving the goods, it's the bride price. The groom pays her family for the honor of marrying her, effectively saying, here's a villa, some slaves, and 3 horses. Now give me your daughter. Roman romance at its finest. The point is, someone is paying someone. You're getting married, and there is absolutely a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about wealth. They were about status, expectations, and public statements. A large dowry might indicate a bride came from a prestigious family. A stingy one might suggest they were trying to offload her quickly, possibly due to suspicious personality traits or a habit of talking back. You, as the bride, didn't usually get to keep your dowry. It became part of the household economy, managed by your husband, guarded by the law, and hopefully not gambled away on chariot races within the first month of marriage. If the marriage ended through death, divorce, or your husband wandering off to join a philosophical school after a midlife crisis, your dowry could theoretically be returned. But retrieving it was often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd need support, legal backing, and ideally someone who could read. Meanwhile, the bride price, if paid, was like buying a rare horse, expensive upfront and no refunds. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labor. After all, who's going to manage the household accounts now? So while love was occasionally in the mix, money was always at the altar. So you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son, or your dowry was suspiciously small, or you just really liked chanting. Either way, you've joined a religious order. Congratulations. You've now taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet here you are, in a sacred temple, surrounded by silence, incense smoke, and Priestess Claudia's unexpectedly melodious voice. Yes, even behind temple walls, forbidden love found a way. To be clear, falling in love in a religious order was deeply discouraged, like you might get exiled or lectured by someone with a very long Latin name. Discouraged. You've sworn to give your heart entirely to the gods, which means giving it to literally no one else. But hearts are unruly, and sometimes prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. Maybe it starts with innocent tasks, passing each other bread during ceremonies, whispering during rituals, laughing a little too hard when someone drops a sacred scroll. Before you know it, you're tucking extra honey cakes into Brother Marcus's satchel and questioning everything. Some priests and priestesses wrote passionate letters, disguised of course as theological musings. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation sounds holy. Unless you read between the lines, and many did, there were inevitably scandals, secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a priestess with a suspiciously round belly. The punishment was usually harsh: exile, public penance, or being reassigned to some far-off temple known mostly for sheep and silence. Still, not all stories ended in disgrace. Some lovers escaped. A few even got married after leaving religious service. Most, though, returned to their temples red-faced and redevoted, swearing that the whole thing was just an overzealous theological debate, because, in the end, religious life was about discipline. But humans are humans even in robes, even in silence, and sometimes a quiet glance across the temple was more thrilling than any gladiator match or chariot race. You did it, you got married. There was a priest, a feast, and someone spilled wine on your mother's only nice stola. But now it's been a few months or years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying donkey. Maybe they forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or maybe you just realized that marrying for land and business connections doesn't automatically result in romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to the world of Roman marital disappointment. Now don't go reaching for the divorce papers because they don't exist, at least not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred and legally binding bond, approved by families, sealed by the gods, and enforced by public shame. You could try for a divorce, but you'd need a very good reason. We don't get along doesn't cut it. You'd have to prove that one of you was underage, already married, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often, or, best case scenario, never consummated the marriage, which meant someone had to confirm that fact in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. If you're a noble, it gets messier. Your marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Trying to escape, it could start a feud, ignite a scandal, or launch a minor war. Best to just quietly resent each other and attend separate dinner parties. So, what do unhappy couples do? Mostly, they just endure. You sleep in different parts of the villa. You sigh dramatically at dinner. You pour your feelings into poetry or that one really angry letter to your brother. Passive aggression becomes your love language. Of course, affairs happened usually quietly, sometimes spectacularly. Nobles had secret lovers. Plebeians had suspiciously helpful neighbors. Society condemned it, of course. But that didn't stop people. It just made them better at sneaking around bathhouses and blaming things on divine will. For women, getting out of a bad marriage was especially hard. Even if your husband was violent or vanished, society expected you to stay loyal, silent, and mildly pious while surviving off bread crusts and disapproval. Still, some people made it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they could become partnerships forged by hardship, habit, and the shared experience of hauling water in the rain. Let's say your spouse dies. Maybe it was plague, maybe a military campaign, maybe they choked on an olive pit during dinner. However it happened, you're now widowed, and suddenly the Roman dating pool opens back up. Being a widow in ancient Rome was oddly liberating. Not do whatever you want liberating, but certainly more freedom than you had before. For women especially, widowhood often brought a taste of independence, managing property, making decisions, even speaking in public without being immediately corrected. And if you were youngish and still had teeth, you could remarry quickly, very quickly. Mourning periods existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with property and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest. Suitors appeared with alarming speed, some sincere, others just very enthusiastic about your real estate investments. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically pushes you back into marriage. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking, maybe the baker's daughter, maybe that quiet widow who always brings suspiciously good bread to market. Romance in second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time around, you're older, wiser. You're not being pushed into an alliance. You're choosing someone to survive with. Maybe even someone you like. Wild concept. Of course, there were rules. The state frowned on remarriage that happened too quickly, like your spouse isn't cold yet, quickly. And widows often had to negotiate with family over dowries and inheritance. Nothing says romantic second chance. Like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the silver dishes. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short, winters were cold. No one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was part of it. Maybe not the swooning, sonnet-writing kind, but the quiet kind, based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, pour the wine, and try again. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've made it this far, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a dramatic temple elopement. But before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the most Roman question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in ancient Rome, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of stars, omens, and whether or not your grandmother saw a raven this morning. Let's begin with astrology. Yes, before you kissed anyone, you might want to consult the local priest astrologer. Are your signs compatible? Is Venus in retrograde? Was your beloved born under an unlucky constellation? If so, better to marry someone less cursed. Love is hard enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that might identify you as your soulmate's long-lost twin or their destined enemy. Superstitions were flexible like that. But the state had its own checklist. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed, unless you had special permission, which the wealthy often bought, because loopholes. So before things got serious, you'd probably need to draw a family tree and then quietly erase parts of it. Social status also mattered deeply. A patrician could not fall in love with a plebeian without it being declared either a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song. And then there were the omens. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, bad sign. If you dropped bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, forget it. That's a cursed union. Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep to protect you from improper suitors. or to sabotage your chances. Either worked. Love in this world wasn't just personal, it was mystical. Everyone had an opinion. The stars, the gods, the ancestors, and that one woman in the market who definitely wasn't a witch. Except she probably was. But despite all the rules, signs, and whispered warnings, people still loved clumsily, bravely, often against advice. Because Roman or not, the heart remains wonderfully disobedient. You've probably heard of Julius Caesar, maybe even Augustus. But have you ever heard of the woman who supposedly seduced Mark Antony away from his political duties and nearly brought down the Roman Empire? Her name was Cleopatra VII, and she didn't rule from a typical throne room filled with Roman eagles. No, her court was the ancient lighthouse of Alexandria. Her army was the wisdom of scholars, and her power came not from Roman citizenship, but from pure intellect, charisma, and the accumulated wealth of the Nile Delta. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman who spoke 9 languages and allegedly wrote treatises on mathematics, astronomy, and political theory. Cleopatra didn't inherit her power from a pampered Roman matron's handbook. She rose through grit, leadership, and possibly a healthy dose of don't mess with me energy. Her people were scholars, engineers, merchants accustomed to female rulers and international trade. But even among such civilized people, she stood out. She was a warrior, a diplomat, and a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand. Now, to be clear, much of what we know about Cleopatra comes from Roman historians, men not exactly known for their strict fact-checking about foreign queens. But if even a fraction of their account is true, then Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was a storm in human form. At the heart of her story is this: a foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day. The Roman Republic, led by ambitious generals, had already conquered Gaul and Greece, and now their gaze turned toward the wealth of Egypt. The Ptolemaic kingdom was next on their list, but Rome didn't fully understand what kind of woman they were dealing with before the first legion marched, before the first ship sailed, and before Caesar's arrival changed everything. Cleopatra was already preparing for negotiation, not because she wanted war, but because she refused submission. She wasn't just defending territory, she was defending a way of life. And as Caesar would soon discover, there are some queens you just don't simply conquer. Julius Caesar had a reputation. He wasn't just any general, he was a conqueror's conqueror, the kind of man who could stroll into ancient cities, topple governments, and still get remembered fondly by historians. So, when he pursued the defeated Pompey toward Egypt, he didn't exactly expect resistance. After all, who could possibly say no to the man who had taken Gaul without even breaking a sweat? Caesar sent a polite offer first, because of course every good imperialist starts with diplomacy. He proposed a political alliance between himself and Cleopatra. Now you might think that's romantic, but Cleopatra saw right through it. She understood that this wasn't about love or even partnership. It was about control. If she submitted to Caesar, her kingdom would become just another Roman province, and she would become a trophy queen. She declined firmly. Caesar, unaccustomed to rejection, didn't take it well. If he couldn't charm her into submission, he would take her kingdom by force. He crossed the Mediterranean with his legions and established a foothold in Alexandria. But Cleopatra wasn't idle. She gathered her advisors, consulted her generals, and prepared for what she knew was coming. Negotiation from a position of strength. Then came the famous meeting. Caesar, under the guidance of his political instincts, expected a traditional surrender ceremony. He got Cleopatra smuggled into his presence, allegedly rolled in a carpet. Though historians debate the details, she didn't arrive as a supplicant, she came as an equal. When Cleopatra appeared before Caesar, she spoke to him in perfect Latin, discussed philosophy, and demonstrated that Egypt's wealth came not from luck but from sophisticated administration. This wasn't just a military conquest anymore. It was a meeting of minds. Caesar needed Egyptian grain to feed Rome's population, Egyptian gold to pay his legions, and Egyptian ships to control the Mediterranean. Cleopatra needed Roman protection from her rivals and Roman recognition of her legitimate rule. When Caesar's enemies in Rome declared him an outlaw and demanded his return, Cleopatra didn't abandon her ally. She provided ships, soldiers, and financing for his civil war. Their relationship, whether romantic or purely strategic, gave Caesar the resources he needed to become dictator. But when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra found herself once again facing Roman ambition, this time in the form of Mark Antony, who controlled the eastern provinces and had his own imperial dreams. She would have to begin the delicate dance of alliance and survival all over again. When Cleopatra learned that Caesar was dead and that Mark Antony now controlled the eastern Roman territories, something inside her shifted. This was no longer about personal alliance, it was about Egyptian independence. And Antony represented both opportunity and existential threat. He wasn't interested in subtle diplomacy. He wanted Egypt's wealth, and he wanted Cleopatra to acknowledge Roman supremacy publicly. But she had learned from her experience with Caesar that Romans respected strength, not submission. So she didn't travel to him as a petitioner, she summoned him to meet her as an equal. According to Roman historians, Cleopatra arrived for their first meeting on a golden barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants dressed as mythological figures with silver oars and purple sails. This wasn't just dramatic flair. This was political theatre designed to remind Antony that he was dealing with a goddess queen, not a provincial ruler. The message was clear. Egypt was ancient, sophisticated, and wealthy, while Rome was powerful but culturally inferior. This time she didn't need to hide in carpets. She could afford to arrive in divine splendor and demand respect. Their alliance, when it developed, was both romantic and strategic. Antony needed Egyptian resources to fund his campaigns against Caesar's assassins and his eventual rival Octavian. Cleopatra needed Roman protection and recognition of her rule over Egypt and Cyprus. Together they controlled the eastern Mediterranean and posed a genuine threat to Octavian's ambitions in Rome. But unlike her relationship with Caesar, this alliance would be tested in open warfare against the western Roman provinces. When diplomacy failed and Antony's political enemies declared war, Cleopatra found herself financing and fighting alongside him in a civil war that would determine the future of both Egypt and Rome. And when the fleets clashed at Actium in 31 BCE, with Octavian's ships blocking their escape route, Cleopatra made a decision that would define her legacy. She ordered her ships to break through the Roman line, not in retreat, but in a final, desperate attempt to preserve Egyptian independence. The naval battle was brutal, confused, and ultimately decisive. When the fighting ended, Antony's fleet was scattered. Cleopatra's ships were captured or sunk, and the last pharaoh of Egypt was facing Roman invasion with no allies and no hope of military victory. The aftermath was swift. Octavian pursued them. To Alexandria, Antony fell on his sword, believing false reports that Cleopatra was already dead, and the Queen of Egypt found herself alone in her palace, facing capture and the prospect of being paraded through Rome as a trophy. Rather than submit to that humiliation, Cleopatra chose death on her own terms. According to legend, she allowed a poisonous asp to bite her, though the exact method remains debated by historians. What matters is that she died as Pharaoh of Egypt, not as a Roman prisoner. With her death ended not just a dynasty, but the last independent Hellenistic kingdom. Egypt became a Roman province. Its wealth would fund imperial expansion for centuries. But its pharaohs, its gods, and its 3,000-year tradition of female rulers died with Cleopatra in that Alexandria palace. To understand Cleopatra, you have to understand the Egypt she ruled. This wasn't some primitive kingdom waiting for Roman civilization. It was the intellectual and commercial center of the ancient world, home to the greatest library ever assembled, and the lighthouse that guided ships from across the Mediterranean. Alexandria rivaled Rome itself in size, wealth, and sophistication. The city's scholars preserved Greek philosophy, advanced mathematics, and pioneered engineering. The museum attracted intellectuals from across the known world, while the harbor bustled with merchants trading goods from India, Arabia, and the African interior. Egyptian agriculture fed not just Egypt, but much of the eastern Mediterranean. The Nile's annual flood deposited fertile silt across thousands of square miles, creating surplus grain that could be exported for gold, silver, and political influence. The pharaoh who controlled this agricultural abundance wielded power that even Rome couldn't ignore. Egyptian religion was ancient, complex, and appealing to those who found Roman gods somewhat impersonal. The goddess Isis promised personal salvation and protection. Her cult spread throughout the Roman world, attracting followers who sought more than civic duty from their deities. Cleopatra wasn't just a political ruler. She was considered the living embodiment of Isis. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries since Alexander's conquest, but they had thoroughly adopted Egyptian customs and religious practices. Unlike Roman governors who imposed their culture, Ptolemaic pharaohs became Egyptian in every way that mattered. They built temples, supported priests, and maintained the ancient traditions. Egyptian women enjoyed rights that would have shocked Roman matrons. They could own property, initiate divorce, conduct business, and inherit estates. Cleopatra's authority wasn't unusual in Egyptian context. It was traditional, so when Roman historians portrayed her as an exotic anomaly, they revealed more about Roman limitations than Egyptian reality. Her court spoke Greek, Egyptian, Latin, and half a dozen other languages. Diplomatic correspondence flowed in multiple scripts, while scholars debated philosophy in the museum's corridors. This was a cosmopolitan kingdom that had been connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe for centuries before Rome existed. In short, Cleopatra wasn't some barbarian queen waiting for Roman enlightenment. She was the heir to Alexander's legacy, the patron of learning, and the ruler of a kingdom that Rome desperately needed but could never truly understand. You know what's fascinating? Everything we know about Cleopatra, her relationship with Caesar, her alliance with Antony, her dramatic death with allegedly poisonous snakes, comes primarily from Roman sources. Men writing decades after the events. For audiences who already considered Egypt a conquered province, Plutarch, Dio, Cassius, Suetonius, these historians had access to contemporary accounts, letters, and official records, but they also had political motivations. They were writing under Roman emperors, for Roman readers who needed to believe that annexing Egypt had been necessary and justified. So how much of Cleopatra's story is accurate? That depends on how much you trust men writing about a foreign queen who had challenged Roman supremacy and lost. Roman historians needed her to be both dangerously seductive and ultimately inferior, both fascinating enough to explain why Caesar and Antony risked everything, and flawed enough to justify her defeat. They emphasized her beauty, her charm, her exotic appeal, but downplayed her intelligence, her political skill, her administrative competence. It was easier to explain Roman victories over a seductress than over a capable ruler who had nearly outmaneuvered two of Rome's greatest generals. But here's what's undeniable. She ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades, maintained independence longer than any other Hellenistic kingdom, and forced Rome to negotiate rather than simply conquer. For the first time in generations, Roman generals had to admit they needed something more than military force. Egyptian sources are limited. Many records were destroyed when Alexandria fell, others were lost over the centuries. But the material evidence suggests a ruler who built temples, patronized scholars, and maintained the agricultural systems that fed the eastern Mediterranean. Roman coins from her reign show her with traditional pharaonic symbols, emphasizing her role as legitimate ruler rather than Roman client. Egyptian temples built during her reign suggest a queen who understood the importance of religious authority, not just political power. In the end, Roman historians didn't just preserve Cleopatra's story, they mythologized her. And while that may blur the lines between fact and propaganda, it also ensured that her name would outlive the empire that destroyed her kingdom. Because history remembers queens who negotiated with emperors even when the emperors write the history. Books. For a queen with no surviving palaces, Cleopatra has haunted Western imagination for over 2,000 years. Renaissance artists adored her. She was the perfect subject for dramatic paintings, mixing exotic appeal with moral instruction about the dangers of foreign influence. In 1635, Claude Lorraine painted her arrival to meet Antony, all golden barges and divine splendor, while Peter, Paul, Rubens depicted her death scene with characteristic Baroque drama. In another painting, she appears regal and composed, while Roman soldiers stand helplessly nearby to European artists. Cleopatra wasn't just a historical figure, she was symbolism incarnate, a woman who embodied both wisdom and temptation, Eastern luxury and political cunning. Depending on who was commissioned to paint her, she could represent the corrupting influence of wealth, the wisdom of ancient learning, or the tragic consequences of ambition. Writers embraced her too. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra presents her as both magnificent and manipulative, a queen whose passion destroys empires. In 18th and 19th century literature, She appeared in plays, novels, and philosophical debates about female power and Eastern decadence. Enlightenment thinkers used her story to discuss whether women could govern effectively, or whether emotion inevitably corrupted political judgment. Romantics saw her as proof that love could challenge empire, while moralists pointed to her downfall as evidence of passion's dangers, but oddly enough, her own people left limited records. The Ptolemaic archives were scattered or destroyed when Alexandria fell, and later Egyptian dynasties showed little interest in preserving the memory of the last pharaoh. Her survival in Western culture depended entirely on Roman accounts. In modern times, Cleopatra has been repeatedly reinvented. Hollywood transformed her into a glamorous movie star. Scholarly biographies attempted to separate historical fact from Roman propaganda. Feminist historians reclaimed her as an example of effective female leadership despite systemic discrimination. She has appeared in everything from historical documentaries to video games, sometimes as a wise ruler, sometimes as a femme fatale, always as someone who refuses to be ignored. That's remarkable longevity for someone whose kingdom lasted only as long as her own lifetime. And here's the strange part. We still don't know what she actually looked like. Roman coins show a woman with strong features, but coin portraits were often more symbolic than realistic. No paintings, sculptures, or mosaics survive from her lifetime, but we know what she represented: intelligence that challenged assumptions, beauty that served political purposes, and authority that refused to submit quietly. She didn't just want to be part of history, she wanted to write it, and in many ways she succeeded. Cleopatra wasn't the first woman to wield power in the ancient world, and she certainly wasn't the last. But Roman historians tend to treat powerful women as exceptions, isolated anomalies in a masculine world. The truth, Cleopatra was part of a tradition of female leadership that stretched across the Mediterranean. Let's step back a bit. Before Cleopatra, there was Hatshepsut, the Egyptian pharaoh who ruled for over 20 years, disguising herself as male in official portraits, but governing as effectively as any king. Around the same time period, there was Dido, the legendary founder of Carthage, who, according to Roman sources, preferred death to forced marriage. In the Hellenistic world, after Alexander's conquests, several kingdoms were ruled by queens. Arsinoe, II controlled Cyprus and parts of Asia Minor, while various Seleucid queens governed Syrian territories. These weren't regents or temporary rulers, they were sovereigns in their own right. And after Cleopatra came more Boudicca, the Celtic queen who led a massive revolt against Roman rule in Britain, burning London and killing thousands of Roman settlers. Zenobia of Palmyra carved out an independent kingdom in the Syrian desert and declared herself Augusta, challenging Roman authority directly. What binds all these women together, Cleopatra included, isn't just power, it's audacity. They governed during eras when political authority supposedly belonged to men. They commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. And while many male rulers were praised for expansion, these women were often labeled dangerous, unnatural, or manipulative. Why? Because they succeeded. Cleopatra wasn't an outlier. She was part of a pattern that Roman historians preferred not to emphasize. Her story, preserved by men who needed to explain how she had nearly outmaneuvered Rome, reminds us that female authority wasn't rare, it was just rarely acknowledged. So when you picture ancient politics, don't just see togas and laurel wreaths, see a queen in her palace, scroll in hand, making decisions that would reshape the Mediterranean. And understand, Cleopatra wasn't alone. She was just one of the few they couldn't completely erase. Cleopatra never built a pyramid. She didn't leave behind golden sarcophagi or preserved temples. There's no great tomb, no royal regalia, no marble bust in a museum. And yet she endures. In many ways, her legacy is perfectly paradoxical. Her entire story depends on Roman historians who portrayed her as both magnificent and dangerous. But those same sources planted seeds that refused to die. For over 2 millennia, her name has surfaced again and again whenever the world needed to remember that intelligence could challenge empire. She's been reimagined through countless lenses. To Renaissance Europe, she was the exotic queen warning about foreign influence. To Enlightenment thinkers, she represented the debate over female governance. To modern scholars, she became a symbol of African leadership and anti-colonial resistance. Statues of her appear in museums worldwide. Children learn her name in history classes. Politicians invoke her when discussing international diplomacy and negotiation. But beyond symbolism and Hollywood, there's something undeniably human about her story. It's about a ruler who inherited an impossible situation, caught between family rivals and foreign powers. It's about someone who chose negotiation over submission, intelligence over force, survival over principle, and ultimately death over humiliation. In a world that often reduces ancient women to wives, mothers, or victims, Cleopatra persists as something more complex. A ruler who made mistakes, took risks, and changed history without asking permission. She reminds us that the ancient world included brilliant women who governed armies, managed economies, and outholed their enemies. She also represents something else, the reminder that even the mightiest empires eventually face leaders they cannot simply conquer or dismiss. Her story survived Roman historians who wanted to diminish her, medieval chroniclers who emphasized her moral failings, and modern scholars who debated her historical importance. And that might be her greatest achievement, the refusal to be forgotten. No monuments required. Her name still appears whenever people discuss female leadership, ancient politics, or the complexity of power in a world that often prefers simple stories. So the next time you hear about a great emperor's triumph, remember, sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't another army, but a queen with a library, a navy, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Across the ancient world, marriage wasn't just a personal choice, it was the foundation of social order, economic stability, and political alliance. From the Roman villa to the Egyptian palace, the institution of marriage shaped everything: laws, property, relationships, and the transfer of power itself. Yet the experience of marriage varied dramatically depending on where you lived, when you lived, and what social class you belonged to. A Roman matron and an Egyptian queen might both be married, but their daily realities were worlds apart. In Rome, marriage was primarily a legal and economic contract designed to unite families, transfer property, and produce legitimate heirs. The emotional experience of the couple was secondary to the social benefits of the alliance. Roman law was specific about property rights, inheritance obligations, and the grounds for divorce. But among the Germanic tribes beyond Rome's borders, marriage customs were different. Brides retained more control over their dowries, kinship obligations were mutual, and divorce, while uncommon, was less legally complicated. The emphasis was on clan loyalty rather than individual property rights. In Egypt, marriage could be with royal power passing through female lines. The pharaoh's legitimacy often depended on marriage to royal sisters or half-sisters, ensuring dynastic continuity. Women retained significant property rights and could initiate divorce proceedings relatively easily. Among nomadic peoples, marriage was often more flexible. Arrangements might be temporary, seasonal, or contingent on economic circumstances, while pastoral communities might practice polygamy when circumstances warranted. But livestock remained the primary measure of wealth and status. What unified these different systems was the understanding that marriage was rarely just about the couple. It affected families, communities, and political relationships. The personal was always political, and the political was often personal. Yet within these structures, real human emotions flourished. Couples fell in love, developed partnerships, and created bonds that transcended legal arrangements. The challenge was finding space for genuine affection within systems designed for other purposes. And despite all the variations in customs and laws, certain patterns emerged across cultures. Women's rights were closely tied to economic systems. Inheritance laws reflected social values, and the treatment of marriage revealed each society's priorities about family, power, and the future. In the end, marriage was both universal and particular. Every culture practiced it, but every culture adapted it to their own needs, values, and circumstances. It was the one institution that touched every aspect of ancient life, yet remained surprisingly diverse in its expressions. You know what's remarkable about ancient Rome? It wasn't just the military conquests or engineering achievements. It was how the empire absorbed, transformed, and transmitted the marriage customs of dozens of different cultures, from British, Celtic hand-fasting to Egyptian divine marriages. As Roman legions conquered new territories, they didn't just impose Roman law. They encountered legal systems that sometimes challenged their own assumptions about family, property, and gender roles. The result was a slow evolution of Roman marriage, customs that incorporated elements from across the Mediterranean. Celtic women, for example, retained property rights after marriage that exceeded what Roman law traditionally allowed. Egyptian royal women governed territories in their own names. Germanic tribal customs included bride prices that differed significantly from Roman dowry systems. Roman legal scholars found themselves creating new categories of marriage to accommodate provincial customs. Citizens could marry according to Roman law, but non-citizens often retained their traditional practices, even within the same province. You might find multiple marriage systems operating simultaneously. This legal flexibility served Roman political interests, keeping local populations content while gradually extending Roman cultural influence. But it also meant that the empire became more diverse, not less diverse, over time. Intermarriage between Romans and provincial families created new social classes. new legal challenges, and new cultural syntheses. The children of these marriages often identified as Roman but retained elements of their mother's or father's original culture. Trade also shaped marriage patterns. Merchant families arranged marriages across ethnic and geographic boundaries, creating networks that facilitated commerce but also cultural exchange. A Roman merchant's daughter might marry a Greek ship owner, creating business partnerships that lasted generations. Military settlements were especially complex. Roman soldiers often married local women, creating hybrid communities that blended military discipline with indigenous customs. These families became the backbone of Romanization in frontier provinces by the later empire. What constituted Roman marriage had expanded far beyond the original patrician customs to include traditions from Gaul, Syria, Egypt, Germania, and dozens of other conquered territories. The empire didn't just rule through force, it ruled through cultural adaptation. And perhaps that's why Roman marriage law remained influential long after the empire fell. It had already incorporated the best elements of multiple legal traditions, creating a system flexible enough to evolve with changing circumstances. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but its approach to marriage as a flexible institution serving multiple social functions became the foundation for European legal systems that persist today. Marriage in the ancient world was far more than romantic partnership. It was the mechanism through which entire civilizations perpetuated themselves, transferred knowledge, and adapted to changing circumstances. From the Roman villa to the nomadic tent, the institution of marriage shaped human history in ways we're still discovering. What made ancient marriage systems remarkable wasn't their uniformity, but their diversity. Each culture adapted the basic concept of formalized partnership to their specific needs, environment, and values. The result was a laboratory of human social organization that tested different approaches to family, property, and power. Some systems emphasized individual choice, others prioritized family alliance. Some transferred wealth through male lines, others through female inheritance. Some permitted easy divorce, others made marriage nearly permanent. The variety was stunning. Yet common themes emerged across cultures. Marriage was always more than personal choice. It was economic transaction, social alliance, political statement, and religious ceremony rolled into one institution. The stakes were high because marriage affected not just the couple, but their families, their descendants, and their communities. The ancient world also reveals how marriage customs evolved in response to external pressures. Warfare, economic change, migration, and cultural contact all influenced how societies structured their marriage systems. What worked in peacetime might prove inadequate during crisis. Women's experiences varied dramatically, but the institution of marriage was consistently central to their social status, economic security, and personal identity. Whether they gained power or lost it through marriage depended largely on the specific legal and cultural context they navigated. For men, marriage brought responsibilities, obligations, and opportunities that extended far beyond the household. The choice of spouse could determine business partnerships, political alliances, and social advancement. Marriage was perhaps the most important decision a man could make. Children, of course, were central to most marriage systems, but the ancient world shows us multiple approaches to kinship, adoption, inheritance, and family structure. Some cultures emphasized bloodlines, others prioritized social bonds. Some valued large families, others preferred quality over quantity. Religion played different roles across cultures. Some societies treated marriage as primarily secular contract, others as sacred sacrament. Some required religious ceremonies, others recognized informal arrangements. The relationship between spiritual and legal marriage varied considerably. What ultimately unified these diverse systems was the recognition that private relationships had public consequences. Marriage was simultaneously intimate and political, personal and social, individual and collective. Ancient peoples understood that how they structured marriage would determine their civilization's future. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from ancient marriage customs. The understanding that our most personal choices inevitably shape our collective destiny. The couple making vows in private were also making commitments that would ripple through generations. So when we study ancient love and marriage, we're not just exploring romantic history, we're examining the foundations of human civilization itself. The bedroom was connected to the Senate house, the family villa to the marketplace, the marriage contract to the political treaty. The ancient world reminds us that love, marriage, and family are never purely private matters. They are the building blocks of everything else we create together. But before we drift into sleep, let's explore a little deeper into the rhythms of Roman daily life. Because understanding love and marriage in antiquity requires understanding the spaces where romance could bloom and the social networks that either encouraged or discouraged emotional connections. Imagine waking up in a Roman domus, the sun filtering through the impluvium as household slaves begin their morning duties. The air fills with the scent of baking bread, olive oil, and the distant sounds of street vendors calling their wares. This is the world where Roman romance unfolded, not in isolated private spaces, but within the complex social ecosystem of family, extended household, and neighborhood. The Roman house itself shaped romantic possibilities. The atrium, where guests were received, was semi-public space where young people might encounter potential marriage partners under the watchful eyes of parents and chaperones. The peristyle garden offered slightly more privacy for supervised conversations, while the tablinum or study provided space for the exchange of letters, poetry, and small gifts. But perhaps most important were the public spaces where Romans spent much of their daily lives, the forum where business was conducted and news was shared, the baths where social networks were maintained and gossip was exchanged, the theaters where emotions could be safely explored through dramatic performance. These venues created the backdrop against which romantic relationships developed. Roman women of the upper classes spent their mornings managing household affairs, receiving visitors, and overseeing the education of their children. But they also participated in religious festivals, visited friends and family, and attended public entertainments. These activities created opportunities for social interaction that extended far beyond the immediate family circle. The afternoon brought different rhythms, perhaps a visit to the baths where women could relax, socialize, and exchange news away. From male oversight, or an afternoon stroll through the gardens where carefully chaperoned encounters with potential suitors might occur, the key was that everything happened within established social frameworks. Evening brought dinner parties and entertainment where the complex dance of Roman social relationships played out. Guests reclined on couches arranged by status and relationship, while slaves served multiple courses and entertainment was provided by musicians, dancers, and poets. These gatherings were where romantic connections were often first established, though always within the bounds of social propriety. For working-class Romans, the rhythms were different but no less structured. The baker's daughter might meet her future husband while helping with early morning bread sales. The blacksmith's son might encounter his bride-to-be at the market where their families conducted business. Romance among the plebs was often more practical, but no less real. Religious festivals provided some of the few occasions when normal social boundaries could be temporarily relaxed. The Saturnalia, when masters served slaves, the Lupercalia, with its fertility rituals, the Floralia celebrating the goddess of flowers. These festivals created sanctioned spaces for behavior that would be scandalous at other times. Yet even during festivals, certain boundaries remained firmly in place. Social class could not be easily transcended. Legal marriage between citizens and non-citizens was prohibited, and family honor always took precedence over individual desire. The temporary relaxation of rules only emphasized how rigid they normally were. Trade and commerce also created opportunities for cross-cultural romantic encounters. Roman merchants traveled throughout the Mediterranean, marrying local women and creating hybrid families that blended Roman and provincial customs. These marriages were often as much about business partnerships as romantic attraction, but they produced children who carried multiple cultural traditions. Military service scattered Roman men across the empire, where they encountered women from dozens of different cultures. The resulting marriages, though sometimes informal, created networks of loyalty and cultural exchange that helped bind the empire together. Love followed the legions, creating connections that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. Slavery, unfortunately, complicated every aspect of Roman romantic life. Slaves could not legally marry, though they often formed lasting partnerships that were recognized within household communities. The children of slave relationships belonged to the slave owner, creating tragic separations when families were sold or inherited. Yet even within the brutal institution of slavery, human connections flourished. Slaves developed strong emotional bonds, created their own informal marriage ceremonies, and fought to protect their children and partners. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, sometimes resulted from romantic relationships between masters and slaves, though such relationships were always fraught with power imbalances. The legal system attempted to regulate romantic behavior through detailed marriage laws, inheritance, regulations, and moral legislation. But laws could only shape behavior. They could not control emotions. Roman literature, poetry, and art are filled with examples of people who defied legal and social conventions in pursuit of love. Letters preserved on papyrus and carved into stone revealed the private emotions that Romans rarely expressed in public. Love spells and curse tablets found in archaeological excavations show the lengths to which people would go to secure or destroy romantic relationships. The gap between public propriety and private passion was often vast. Roman religion provided both support and challenges for romantic relationships. Certain deities were associated with love and marriage, while others demanded celibacy and renunciation. Religious festivals created opportunities for courtship. But religious vows could also separate lovers. The gods, it seemed, were as conflicted about human passion as humans. Themselves, education played a crucial role in determining romantic possibilities. Upper-class Romans, both male and female, were educated in literature, philosophy, and rhetoric, creating shared intellectual foundations for relationships among the educated elite. A love of poetry or philosophical discussion could form the basis for lasting emotional connections. Yet education also created barriers. The vast majority of Romans were illiterate, limiting their access to the love poetry, letter writing, and literary culture that enhanced romance among the elite. Different levels of education could make marriages between social classes even more difficult to sustain. Medicine and healthcare in the Roman world also affected romantic relationships. Knowledge of contraception and fertility treatments was limited and often ineffective. High infant mortality rates meant that the production of heirs was a constant concern. Childbirth was dangerous for women, making the choice of marriage partner literally a matter of life and death. The Roman economy, with its reliance on slavery and its extreme inequality, meant that romantic choices were always constrained by economic reality. Even among free citizens, the need to maintain or improve social status through marriage limited the pool of acceptable partners. Love might bloom, but practical considerations usually determined its fate. Travel within the Roman Empire was relatively safe and common, creating opportunities for long-distance relationships. Roman roads, postal systems, and commercial networks meant that lovers could maintain correspondence across vast distances, though the delays inherent in ancient communication systems tested even the strongest emotional bonds. Seasonal rhythms also shaped romantic relationships. Winter brought families together in closer quarters, creating opportunities for intimate conversation, but also increasing tensions. Summer brought festivals, travel, and military campaigns that could separate lovers for months at a time. The agricultural calendar determined when weddings could be celebrated and when children were born. Food and dining, customs created important contexts for romantic relationships. The Roman banquet was a carefully choreographed social event where seating arrangements, conversation topics, and even the foods served carried symbolic meanings. Sharing a meal was an intimate act that could signal everything from casual friendship to serious romantic interest. Clothing and personal adornment allowed Romans to send subtle signals about their romantic availability and social status. The toga for men and the stola for women were not just garments, but symbols of citizenship and respectability. Jewelry, hairstyles, and cosmetics conveyed messages about wealth, taste, and marital status. Music and dance provided emotional outlets that complemented the more formal aspects of Roman courtship. Poetry was often set to music and performed at social gatherings, while dance allowed for limited physical contact within socially acceptable boundaries. The rhythm of music could express emotions that words alone could not convey. Roman attitudes toward aging and physical beauty also influenced romantic relationships. While youth was generally prized, especially in women, mature relationships based on companionship and mutual respect, were also valued. The Roman ideal of dignitas suggested that true attractiveness came from character, achievement, and social position as much as physical appearance. The cycle of life and death in the Roman world meant that most people experienced multiple losses of loved ones. Plague, warfare, and disease created frequent separations, while the relatively short life expectancy meant that successful relationships had to develop quickly and adapt to constant change. Roman law distinguished between different types of marriage arrangements, from the formal conferatio, ceremony reserved for the highest social classes, to the informal useus marriage that could develop through cohabitation. These legal distinctions reflected the empire's recognition that emotional relationships took many forms. Inheritance, law created additional complexities for romantic relationships, since property passed primarily through male lines, while women often brought substantial dowries to marriage. The death of a spouse could dramatically alter a person's economic and social situation, making remarriage both necessary and complicated. Regional variations within the Roman Empire meant that marriage customs differed significantly between provinces. What was acceptable in cosmopolitan Alexandria might be scandalous in conservative rural Italy, while Germanic tribes had different concepts of marriage altogether than did Greek city-states. The gradual spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire introduced new ideas about marriage, sexuality, and romantic relationships. Christian emphasis on celibacy, marriage as indissoluble sacrament, and spiritual love challenged traditional Roman pragmatism about romantic relationships, creating tensions that would persist for centuries. Roman colonial expansion brought Roman marriage customs into contact with cultures around the Mediterranean and beyond. The resulting cultural exchanges produced hybrid forms of romantic relationships that combined Roman legal frameworks with local traditions, creating new possibilities for love and marriage. Artistic representations of love and marriage in Roman culture, from wall paintings in Pompeii to sculptures in public spaces, reveal how Romans understood and idealized romantic relationships. These images often emphasized harmony between spouses, mutual affection, and the importance of family. Lineage. The Roman postal system and communications networks allowed for long-distance courtships and marriages that would have been impossible in earlier periods. Lovers could exchange letters across the empire, while families could negotiate marriage contracts between distant cities, expanding the geographic scope of romantic possibility. Roman concepts of honor and shame profoundly influenced how romantic relationships developed and were maintained. Public reputation was crucial for both men and women, meaning that romantic behavior had to be carefully managed to avoid scandal that could damage not just individuals but entire families. Seasonal festivals and religious observances created recurring opportunities for romantic encounters, while also imposing temporary restrictions on certain activities. The Roman calendar was filled with days that were considered auspicious or inauspicious for weddings, romantic encounters, and marriage. Negotiations. The institution of slavery created complex emotional dynamics within Roman households. While masters legally owned their slaves, emotional relationships inevitably developed between people living in close proximity. Some of these relationships were exploitative, while others involved genuine affection despite the legal inequality. Roman military culture, with its emphasis on honor, brotherhood, and loyalty, created alternative models of intense emotional relationships that sometimes competed with or complemented romantic attachments. The bonds formed between soldiers could last lifetimes and influence their choices about marriage and family. The Roman legal system's recognition of adoption as equivalent to biological parentage meant that family relationships could be created through choice rather than birth. This flexibility extended to marriage relationships, allowing families to strengthen alliances through strategic adoptions that facilitated later marriages. Roman attitudes toward mental and physical health included understanding that emotional relationships affected overall well-being. Physicians recognized that lovesickness was a real condition, while philosophers debated whether passionate love was beneficial or harmful to human flourishing. The Roman Empire's cultural diversity meant that people regularly encountered different concepts of beauty, attractiveness, and romantic appeal. This exposure to multiple aesthetic traditions may have created more flexible attitudes toward physical appearance and romantic compatibility. Trade relationships often evolved into romantic relationships as merchants and craftspeople developed personal connections with their customers and suppliers. The economic partnerships that sustained Roman commerce frequently blended business and emotional attachments in ways that strengthened both. Roman architectural innovations like the hypercost heating system and improved glass windows created more comfortable domestic spaces that supported intimate relationships, while public architecture like baths and theaters provided venues for the social interactions that often preceded romantic attachments. The Roman system of patronage created networks of obligation and loyalty that influenced romantic choices. Clients and patrons often arranged marriages within their networks, while the children of these relationships inherited both emotional bonds and political alliances. Seasonal migration patterns within the Roman Empire brought people together and separated them in regular cycles, creating relationships that had to adapt to long periods of separation, followed by intense reunions. These patterns may have influenced Roman attitudes toward the permanence and flexibility of romantic attachments. Roman funeral customs and attitudes toward death emphasized the importance of maintaining family memory and honor across generations. Romantic relationships were valued partly for their role in continuing family lines and preserving ancestral traditions. The Roman Empire's legal recognition of multiple forms of marriage and partnerships reflected practical understanding that emotional relationships developed in many different ways. Rather than forcing all relationships into a single legal framework, Roman law adapted to accommodate various forms of romantic attachment. Roman literature, from Ovid's love poetry to the novels of Petronius, reveals the gap between official moral teaching and actual romantic behavior. Writers often celebrated the very relationships that legislators and moralists condemned, suggesting widespread acceptance of emotional freedom despite legal restrictions. The Roman bath culture created unique opportunities for romantic relationships. While men and women typically bathed separately, the social networks formed at baths often facilitated introductions and marriage negotiations. The relaxed atmosphere of the baths allowed for conversations that might be impossible in more formal settings. Roman religious practices included numerous festivals and rituals specifically devoted to love, fertility, and marriage. These observances provided sanctioned opportunities for romantic behavior while also reinforcing community values about appropriate relationships. The Roman system of education, particularly for upper-class women, created a generation of women who could participate as intellectual equals in romantic relationships. Shared literary interests, philosophical discussions, and artistic appreciation became foundations for marriages that transcended purely economic considerations. Roman transportation networks, including roads, harbors, and navigational techniques, made long-distance relationships more feasible than ever before. Lovers could maintain contact across the empire, while families could arrange marriages between distant provinces. The Roman legal concept of citizenship created clear distinctions between who could and could not legally marry. While these restrictions prevented some romantic relationships, they also created strong incentives for social advancement through military service, business success, or political achievement. Roman medical knowledge, while limited by modern standards, included understanding of some contraceptive methods and fertility treatments. This knowledge gave couples some ability to plan their families and control the timing of children, though such control was far from reliable. The Roman Empire's eventual embrace of Christianity introduced concepts of spiritual love and marriage as sacrament that transformed how people understood romantic relationships. The tension between Christian ideals and Roman pragmatism would shape European attitudes toward love and marriage for centuries. Roman artistic traditions, particularly in wall painting and sculpture, frequently depicted romantic scenes that idealized married love while also acknowledging the reality of extramarital relationships. These artistic representations suggest that Romans held complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes toward romantic fidelity. The Roman calendar, with its complex system of lucky and unlucky days, regulated when marriages could be celebrated, and romantic relationships could be formalized. This temporal structure meant that romantic relationships often had to develop according to religious and social schedules rather than purely emotional timing. Roman concepts of masculinity and femininity, while restrictive by modern standards, still allowed for considerable variation in romantic behavior. Strong women and sensitive men could find acceptance within certain social contexts, even if they challenged conventional gender expectations. The Roman Empire's multiculturalism created opportunities for romantic relationships that crossed ethnic and cultural boundaries, while also creating challenges when different marriage customs conflicted. These cross-cultural relationships often produced children who embodied the empire's diversity. Roman economic systems, including the use of money rather than barter, facilitated romantic relationships by making dowries and bride prices more flexible and precise. The monetization of the economy meant that marriage negotiations could be conducted with greater precision and less ambiguity. The Roman postal system's reliability meant that romantic correspondence could be maintained across vast distances with reasonable confidence that letters would arrive. This communication infrastructure supported relationships that would have been impossible in earlier periods. Roman social mobility, while limited compared to modern standards, still allowed for some individuals to improve their circumstances through marriage, military service, or business success. These opportunities meant that romantic relationships could sometimes transcend social boundaries. Roman attitudes toward privacy and public life meant that romantic relationships had to be carefully managed to maintain appropriate boundaries between personal feelings and social responsibilities. The Roman emphasis on public virtue required that private emotions be expressed within acceptable limits. The Roman Empire's long period of relative peace, the Pax Romana, created stable conditions that allowed romantic relationships to develop without the constant disruption of warfare. This stability meant that couples could make long-term plans and invest emotionally in relationships that might last decades. Roman funeral monuments and epitaphs often celebrated married love and family relationships, suggesting that while marriages might begin as practical arrangements, they frequently developed into genuine emotional partnerships. The archaeological record preserves numerous examples of couples who chose to be buried together. The Roman system of slavery unfortunately created situations where romantic relationships were complicated by legal inequality and potential exploitation. While some relationships between masters and slaves may have involved genuine affection, the power imbalance meant that consent was always questionable. Roman religious diversity meant that couples from different religious backgrounds had to navigate varying attitudes toward marriage, sexuality, and family relationships. The empire's general tolerance for religious diversity extended to accepting different marriage customs within certain limits. The Roman Empire's urbanization created new social environments where romantic relationships could develop. City life brought together people from diverse backgrounds while providing entertainment venues and public spaces where supervised courtship could occur. Roman agricultural cycles influenced the timing of marriages and romantic relationships. Since wedding celebrations required substantial food and drink preparations, marriages were often timed to coincide with harvest seasons when families could afford elaborate festivities. Roman legal traditions that distinguished between different types of sexual relationships reflected practical understanding that human emotions and desires took many forms. Rather than imposing a single standard, Roman law recognized various forms of romantic attachment. The Roman Empire's gradual transformation from republic to empire changed the political context of marriage relationships. As power became more centralized in the imperial court, marriage alliances became tools of imperial policy, affecting even ordinary citizens. Roman literary traditions preserved love letters, poetry, and romantic stories that provide insights into how people actually experienced romantic relationships despite legal and social restrictions. The survival of this literature suggests that romantic love was valued even when it conflicted with practical considerations. Roman engineering achievements, including improved housing, heating, and sanitation, created domestic environments that supported intimate family relationships, while public works like theaters and baths provided venues for the social interactions that often led to romantic attachments. The Roman Empire's economic prosperity during its peak allowed many families to consider romantic compatibility. Alongside practical concerns when arranging marriages, prosperity created choices that were unavailable during periods of economic hardship. Roman military traditions that emphasized loyalty, honor, and brotherhood created alternative models of intense emotional attachment that sometimes competed with romantic relationships. The bonds formed during military service could influence veterans' choices about marriage and family. Roman concepts of time, including the division of days into hours and the organization of years into calendars, created temporal frameworks within which romantic relationships developed. Seasonal festivals, anniversary celebrations, and planned reunions gave structure to emotional relationships. The Roman Empire's diverse population meant that concepts of physical beauty and romantic attraction were constantly evolving as people encountered different aesthetic traditions. This diversity may have created more inclusive attitudes toward appearance and romantic compatibility. Roman transportation technology, including improved ships and road systems, made possible romantic relationships that spanned the Mediterranean world, while also creating separations when military service or business required travel. Roman religious practices that emphasized family, ancestors, and household gods gave romantic relationships spiritual dimensions that extended beyond the couple to include connections with deceased relatives and future generations. The Roman legal system's recognition of women's property rights, while limited by modern standards, still provided some economic independence that could influence romantic choices. Women with property had more options and potentially more influence in marriage. Negotiations. Roman educational practices that emphasized rhetoric and public speaking created shared cultural experiences that could form the basis for romantic relationships. Couples who could discuss literature, philosophy, and politics had intellectual foundations for their emotional connections. Roman medical practices, while limited, included some understanding of mental and emotional health. Physicians recognized that romantic relationships affected overall well-being and sometimes prescribed social interaction as treatment for various ailments. The Roman Empire's cultural achievements in art, literature, and philosophy created intellectual environments where romantic relationships could develop around shared aesthetic and philosophical interests. These cultural connections often transcended social and economic boundaries. Roman funeral practices that emphasized maintaining family memory across generations meant that romantic relationships were valued partly for their role in continuing family traditions and preserving ancestral honor. The Roman Empire's legal flexibility that allowed for various forms of marriage and partnership reflected practical recognition that emotional relationships developed in many different ways. Rather than forcing conformity, Roman law adapted to accommodate human diversity. Roman seasonal festivals provided recurring opportunities for romantic encounters while also creating temporary spaces where normal social boundaries could be relaxed. These festivals gave structure to romantic relationships by providing predictable occasions for courtship and celebration. And so, as dawn approaches and these tales of ancient love begin to fade like morning mist over the Tiber, remember that the human heart has always found ways to express itself despite laws, customs, and social expectations. The Romans may have built their empire with discipline and organization, but they filled it with the same hopes, dreams, and romantic longings that drive us today. Their togas may have been different, their gods unfamiliar, their customs strange, but their hearts beat with the same rhythms of attraction, desire, and love that echo in our own lives tonight. Across the centuries, their whispered promises still carry on the wind, reminding us that some things remain eternal. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of an unbroken chain of human emotion that stretches from the marble palaces of ancient Rome to your own quiet bedroom tonight. The empire may have fallen, the emperors forgotten, but love endures, as it always has, as it always will.